This is a tale of the most audacious counterfeiter in modern history. Frank Bourassa had a simple yet unthinkable goal: to print $250 million in fake US currency. His story isn't just one of high-stakes deception, it is a masterclass in meticulous planning and international intrigue. From sourcing special paper to dodging law enforcement, Bourassa's life reads like a page of a thriller novel. Today, we're going to unfold the gripping saga of how one man nearly became a quarter-billionaire, got busted, and then essentially got away with a slap on the wrist. So, Frank Bourassa was born in Trois-Rivières in Quebec, a suburb of Montreal. His criminal career began when he was only 12 years old and he was in 7th grade. Frank saw that older students would come into school with bags full of expensive clothing that they'd shoplifted, and he saw an opportunity. He could act as a middleman, fencing the stolen goods to his classmates. It didn't matter that this was both illegal and against the school's rules. All that mattered was that he had a steady supply of product and customers. This allowed him to make hundreds of dollars every week. According to Frank, it was great. It gave me a very nice boost towards independence. And that independence would be important because by the time he was 15 years old, Frank was expelled from school and moved out of his parents' house. Initially, he sought legitimate employment, getting a job as a mechanic. However, this again gave him an opportunity to be a middleman for illegal activities. He began selling stolen car parts before upgrading to selling entire stolen cars. Frank continued making money this way into his 20s, at which point he decided that he was going to go clean. Since he already had experience working with cars, he decided to set up his own factory manufacturing brake pads. And, well, this went horribly, but not because his business failed. Frank was actually running a successful factory. It was taking a massive toll on him personally. He would routinely work 20-hour days, and the constant stress and exertion completely drained him both physically and mentally. It resulted in a nervous breakdown, with Frank suffering panic attacks as well as constant sweating and shaking. When he went to see a doctor, Frank recalled being told that he had every vitamin deficiency. Even though the business was profitable, Frank had to sell it off for the sake of his health. He took the money from the sale of the factory and spent the next 2 years traveling the world with his girlfriend. When it was finally time to return home to Canada, Frank vowed to never make money through legitimate means again. He felt that the personal costs of being a legitimate businessman simply wasn't worth it. Instead, he turned to growing and selling marijuana. The marijuana trade was going through a boom in Canada at the time. It was a much easier way to make money than working 20-hour days. But eventually, these illegal activities had to catch up with him. Frank was arrested in 2006 on drug charges and sentenced to 3 months in prison. Once he was released, Frank again needed to come up with a way to make money. He still knew plenty of people involved in the criminal world, but even that was starting to seem somewhat pointless. Frank talked about how he would see cocaine deals go down involving a dozen armed guards, and for what? $20,000? It just didn't seem worth it to him. But in 2008, while sitting at a red light, Frank had his epiphany. Why the hell go through all this hassle of finding product, selling it, finding customers, accounting, and all of that trouble to bring it back as money? Frank loved money, but he didn't want to deal with all of that hassle. So he settled on what seemed like the only obvious solution. He would just print his own money. Now Frank had a plan, but there was a problem. He didn't know the first thing about counterfeiting money. For that matter, he didn't know the first thing about printing at all. Luckily, he had a secret weapon up his sleeve. Frank wasn't going to be counterfeiting Canadian currency, he was going to be printing American $20 bills. According to Frank, American bills are the easiest to counterfeit because they're still printed on paper rather than on polymers. Not only that, but American currency is accepted all over the world. That would make them easier to produce and easier to move, but it still didn't address the fact that Frank didn't know the first thing about counterfeiting. To fix that, he simply visited official US government websites. While bouncing from one internet cafe to another to avoid drawing suspicion to himself, Frank obtained all the information that he would need to counterfeit his bills from official government sources, with a shocking level of detail being provided. The recipe for making American banknotes, 75% cotton and 25% linen, all of the various security features, and even the specific printing press used by the US Treasury, was all available information on those websites. All he needed to do was find somebody to manufacture the paper for him. And that paper had to be perfect. The number one way that counterfeit bills are detected is by feel. And if it wasn't that exact 75-25 split, then the people who handled the fake money would know it was fake immediately. It was here that Frank encountered his first real problem, which was finding somebody to make the paper for him. Initially, he used the fake name Thomas Moore, a representative from a fake stationery company called The Letter Shop. In emails, Moore claimed to be looking to get some special paper made for a client. He described it as rag paper made of cotton and maybe with some linen thrown in. This proved far from effective, as the recipe for America's paper currency isn't actually a secret. In fact, it's the exact opposite of a secret. Since 1879, the paper company Crane & Co. from Massachusetts has been the only ones to produce currency paper for the US government. It's the only thing their paper mill makes, and they're the only ones that are allowed to make it. So when Frank sent emails out to companies in search of paper manufacturers, the replies essentially all read, "Cotton and linen blends, huh? You're looking to print some counterfeit currency there, buddy?" And with that, the conversations would be all but over. But Frank didn't give up. He was sure that somewhere in the world there had to be a paper company that was either stupid or crooked enough to grant his request. He also refined his strategy, changing his fake name to Jackson Maxwell from the Keystone Investment and Trading Company. He claimed that they were looking to make $30 and $40 bond certificates on rag paper that would be resistant to counterfeiting. In January of 2009, he finally found a taker, the Artos Paper Company out of Switzerland. Over the course of many emails, Frank would gradually change the specifications of what he needed manufactured. The part he thought would be his undoing was when he requested a security strip to be printed alongside the paper that read USA 20, which he claimed were for his $20 bonds. He also requested that they watermark the paper. Artos were willing to do this, but they didn't have the necessary equipment, so Frank had to order a $15,000 cylindrical printing drum from Germany to be shipped to Artos so that they could fulfill his order. Surprisingly, this was one of the easier parts of the plan. If you were to send a picture of Andrew Jackson to an American company and ask them to watermark your paper with the image, the Secret Service would be at your door in no time. But to Europeans, the picture was just some random dude. Even if they were somewhat familiar with the look of US currency, Jackson's face wasn't immediately recognizable to them. That fall, Frank finally received sample sheets of the paper, and it was absolutely perfect. As far as he was concerned, it was completely indistinguishable from regular currency. All that was left to do was place his order. He ordered $50,000 worth of the paper, the smallest order that Artos would fulfill. After some quick calculations, Frank realized that this was enough to print $250 million in $20 bills. He could sell it for 30 cents on the dollar, pocketing a quick $80 million and never have to work again. While all these negotiations had been going on with the paper company, Frank also needed to get his printing press. Luckily for him, he discovered that an acquaintance of his worked at a professional printing company and also happened to have done some prison time. Assuming the man had flexible morals, Frank contacted him to advise on the purchase of a printing press. They settled on a Heidelberg offset printer. It wasn't identical to the ones used by the US Mint, which would likely have been a suspicious purchase, but it was close enough. He also needed to purchase a paper cutter, plate-making equipment, and inkjet printers to add the serial numbers. In total, the venture cost Frank $300,000, funded by his continued illegal drug sales. With everything purchased, all that was left to do was wait for the paper to arrive so that he could begin printing his counterfeit bills. Assuming that he didn't get arrested at the docks, that is. So, towards the end of 2009, the call came in that Frank's shipment had arrived at the docks and he could come and pick it up. But he knew that he couldn't actually just go and pick it up. That would be too dangerous. Instead, he grabbed a pair of binoculars and spent 3 days surveilling the shipment for any signs of activity. His order should have been highly suspicious to the company that printed it, so Frank believed that there was a good chance the authorities had been contacted and were waiting for somebody to come and pick up the container. But after 3 days of watching, there was nothing, so it was time to move the shipment to another location. Frank hired a box truck to load the paper shipment onto and hired a second car to drive behind the truck. When the truck was approaching the highway on-ramp, where the traffic bottlenecked to a single lane, the second car pretended to break down, blocking traffic. The second driver was able to block off traffic for 20 minutes before getting in his car and starting it again, giving the truck plenty of time to escape anybody that might have been following them. However, it still wasn't time to bring the paper to its final destination. Instead, the truck was brought to a parking lot where it would again sit under 24-hour surveillance for 3 days. Throughout his entire ordeal, Frank kept hiring a revolving door of new accomplices, never using the same person twice. They all undoubtedly knew that something illegal was taking place, but they had no idea what it was. And by consistently hiring new people, it reduced the chance that anybody could figure out what his actual plan was. If apprehended, these accomplices wouldn't have any useful information. Once 3 more uneventful days had passed, it was time to move the paper again. Frank hired another box truck, and the paper was loaded onto new pallets in case there were any tracking devices on the original pallets. He then took it to a garage that he'd rented from a farmer, where he had the printing press located. The farmer had no idea what was going on in the garage, though Frank indicated he likely knew something illegal was going on, and he just didn't want to ask any questions. With everything now in place, Frank was ready to start printing his counterfeit money. For the next 5 months, he would tuck his girlfriend into bed every night, go to the garage and print money, and then return to bring his girlfriend breakfast before heading back to work. They were long days, but it was worth it. As the bills started coming off the press, Frank realized that he was rich. But he didn't start trying to move the money right away. Before he sold any of his counterfeit money, he wanted to get all of it printed. There was no money coming in during that 5 months of printing, but by the time he was done, he would have printed approximately $250 million. Once it was all printed, Frank hired an old criminal friend of his to help find customers. To his surprise, this was a lot easier said than done. His friend contacted some big-time drug dealers, the kind of people that would be moving large amounts of cocaine. Their response to Frank's offer of buying counterfeit bills was, "No thanks, and be careful." Frank was completely bewildered that people doing what he felt were much more severe crimes than he were telling him to be careful, but he couldn't give up. The money was all printed and he needed to find somebody to take it off his hands. Eventually, Frank managed to find 4 buyers. On the surface, they seemed perfect because they were all importer-exporters who planned to sell the money overseas. This was an ideal situation because if the counterfeits were detected in Asia, Europe, or Africa, it would be less likely that their source would be traced back to Canada. However, the buyers weren't interested in taking large amounts of counterfeit cash, at least not at first. Initial orders were small, only $10,000. Frank was frustrated, but once the buyers saw the quality of these bills, they were hooked. They upped their orders to $100,000 at a time, eventually increasing their orders to $1 million. It was a good start, but at this rate, it was going to take too long to move all the cash. He needed more customers, and he was put in touch with a local man, Eric Lefebvre. Lefebvre dealt in stolen heavy equipment, and for 2 years, he had unknowingly been selling stolen dump trucks to an undercover cop. When Lefebvre asked the undercover cop if he would be interested in buying some counterfeit money, the cop, of course, jumped at the chance. He ordered $100,000 in fake bills, which Frank delivered to Lefebvre personally. Lefebvre then delivered them to the cop, who was impressed with their quality. He wanted to buy another $100,000 the next day, and Frank obliged. This time, however, Frank wasn't feeling as confident. He didn't know it, but a helicopter had tailed Lefebvre to the house of a mutual friend where they would make the exchange. The undercover cop had only dealt with Lefebvre, not Frank personally, so the police still didn't know who they were after. Normally, Frank would have just parked in the driveway and taken the box of cash into Lefebvre's house, but that day, something felt off to him. The helicopter was flying too high for it to be seen or heard, but in an abundance of caution, Frank decided to back his car all the way into the garage. This meant surveillance never actually had eyes on him and the money, which would be immensely important down the line. So, at 5 a.m., on May the 23rd, 2012, Frank and his girlfriend were woken up by the police pounding on the door to their house, demanding to be let in. Up until that point, his girlfriend had absolutely no idea what Frank had been up to. She probably smoked weed with Frank, but beyond that, she was an innocent schoolteacher, completely unaware that Frank was committing some pretty major crimes. After telling his girlfriend not to say or do anything, Frank let the police inside. He was immediately placed in handcuffs, and the police began searching the house. And they found plenty. There were guns, though these were likely legally owned, pens for testing counterfeit bills, some marijuana, and most importantly, just under $1 million in counterfeit $20 bills, as well as a couple of plates used in the printing process. As far as the dozen Canadian police officers and 2 US Secret Service agents that were present for the arrest were concerned, they'd just nailed Frank. That was a lot of counterfeit money in his possession, so surely they felt they had him dead to rights. When Frank was brought in for questioning, he initially remained silent. However, once police informed him that his girlfriend had been arrested and her home might be seized, he confessed to everything. Or at least to everything they already knew. Frank said that she wasn't involved at all and everything had been him. Aside from not wanting his girlfriend to get in trouble for his actions, this was a calculated risk that Frank had known was a possibility from the start. He stated, "I figure if I get hit real hard, I'd get 6 or 7 years. In Canada, you do 1/6 of the sentence. So maybe I'd do 12 to 15 months. No one wants to spend a year in prison, but when it came down to it, I could do it. It's manageable." However, there was something that Frank hadn't figured into his calculations. In the frenzy of being woken up at 5 a.m. by the RCMP, Frank may not have noticed that there were Secret Service agents on the scene as well. They made their presence known by entering the interrogation room and informing Frank that he was going to be extradited to the United States. The penalty he had calculated from the Canadian legal system was what he could manage, but the Secret Service wasn't going to let him off with just a year. In America, there would be 3 separate charges. One for possessing counterfeit bills, one for the counterfeit plates found in his girlfriend's home, and one for transferring the bills to Lefebvre. Each charge carried with it a 20-year penalty, so he could potentially spend 60 years in prison. Since he was already 42 years old, 60 years would have been a death sentence. Dejected, Frank asked the agents how long he'd realistically be sentenced to. They said the closest case they could think of, which also happened to involve a Canadian citizen, resulted in a 9-year sentence. Wanting to equate the Canadian and American legal systems, Frank then asked how many of the 9 years the man actually served. The agent replied, he died in jail. And with that, Frank was sent to prison without bail to await extradition. But luckily for Frank, he had a good lawyer, and that lawyer had a plan to get the entire case against his client dropped. The police surveillance of Lefebvre showed Frank pull into the garage, but they never actually saw him carrying the money or handing it to the man. As such, the lawyer argued that the search warrant the police had executed was unlawful and that all of the evidence obtained from it was inadmissible. This defense wasn't a slam dunk, but it was grounds to file a motion to dismiss the entire case, and there was certainly a possibility that the judge was going to grant that motion. But before filing such a motion, Frank wanted his lawyer to negotiate with the prosecution. If the Crown would stop the extradition proceedings, then Frank's attorney would not file the motion to dismiss. The United States obviously wasn't going to be happy with this deal, but the prosecution didn't want to risk their entire case being blown up. And even if Frank was sacrificing what may have been his only attempt to avoid conviction in Canada, it was worth it to avoid dying in federal prison in America. The deal was struck, and Frank's lawyer managed to get him released on a $10,000 bail after having spent only 6 weeks in jail. Frank got an honest job doing construction while the prosecution continued to improve their case. Maybe it was paranoia, but Frank believed he was being tailed by cars constantly and that his phone was tapped. Out of an abundance of caution, he never talked to anybody about the money or the counterfeiting operation, and he never went to the farmer's garage out of which it operated. The only piece of evidence the authorities were still after was the Heidelberg printing press that had been used. Before his arrest, Frank had listed it for sale on a site that dealt in industrial equipment, and in September of 2012, he received an email from somebody looking to purchase it. That person turned out to be an undercover cop, but Frank wound up getting a bad feeling about it and never went through with the deal. Over the next year, Frank's lawyer tried to negotiate with the prosecution, and in the fall of 2013, the Crown made its final offer. Frank would plead guilty and be sentenced to 3 years in prison, of which he would likely only serve 6 months. It was an extremely good deal, and one that Frank's lawyer sincerely wanted him to take. But against his lawyer's advice, Frank declined. That December, the trial was set to begin. As Frank and his lawyer walked into the courthouse before the proceedings began, Frank turned to his lawyer and asked him, "If I had $200 million, can you do something with that?" The lawyer's initial response was, "Are you kidding me?" Once he clarified that Frank really did have that much counterfeit cash, the answer was that yes, he absolutely could do something with that. The prosecution wasn't happy with the situation, but they couldn't just leave that amount of counterfeit cash out in the wild. Frank was willing to give them all of the money and the printing press, but in exchange he wanted his jail sentence reduced to the 6 weeks that he'd already served, and for his car to be returned, and for the government to stop trying to seize his girlfriend's house. Frank's only punishment, other than the 6 weeks that he'd previously served, was a $1,350 fine for drug possession. They were extremely annoyed about it, but accepting this deal was the prosecution's only choice. However, they did have one more trick up their sleeves. The date of the handoff was set for January the 31st. Frank wasn't a free man until the handoff took place, but he wasn't going to be kept in holding either. That gave the police a little over a month to watch his every move and hope that they would lead him to the money. If they could get their hands on that $200 million before the agreed-upon date, they could cancel the deal entirely and extradite him to the United States. Now, it seems like this wouldn't be a big deal. Frank just had to stay away from the fake money for a month and the police would have no way to find it. The only problem was that just like Frank didn't want his girlfriend to get in any trouble for his actions, he didn't want the farmer he rented the garage to get into trouble either. Sure, the farmer may have known, or at least suspected, that Frank was up to something untoward, but he certainly had no idea exactly what he was doing or on what scale. Luckily, Frank had managed to plan for something like this. 2 months earlier, before he even told his lawyer about the money, Frank had managed to contact a friend of his. That friend rented a box truck, went to the garage to load up all the money and the printing press, and then dropped the truck off in the parking lot of a hotel where another of Frank's associates worked. While the associate would likely check on the truck now and again, for the most part, the $200 million in counterfeit money had just been sitting in a parking lot, completely unguarded, with nothing but a simple padlock to keep it from being discovered. On January 31st, 2014, Frank went to his local RCMP station so that he could direct a motorcade of police and Secret Service to the location of the money. Once there, Frank opened the back of the truck and revealed the mountain of cash and the Heidelberg press sitting on the truck. Keeping all of this counterfeit money off of the streets should have been a huge win, even if they were aggravated that Frank was avoiding jail time by having printed so much, but the Secret Service was furious about the entire situation. In the time between the agreement being signed and the official handoff that would finalize the deal, the Secret Service managed to track the original paper order to Artos. Based on the size of the order, they now realized that Frank had printed $250 million, not just the $200 million that was being seized. That meant that there was $50 million in nearly flawless counterfeit bills being circulated, but with the deal already signed, their hands were tied. Frank managed to keep the location of the money secret until the handoff date, and he was now officially free from prosecution from both Canadian and American authorities. Now, though the RCMP has officially stated that they have dropped the investigation into Frank, they have kept an open investigation into the massive counterfeiting ring that they believed must have existed. The RCMP believed that one man couldn't have pulled this off on his own, but Frank disagreed. Not only has he given a detailed description of exactly how he pulled everything off, but he had this rather salient point to add. In what world would any criminal or criminal organization give $200 million to a front guy so that he could give it to the courthouse instead of giving him a couple of bullets in the back of the head? And it's hard to disagree with that, but the police insist that there must be a larger criminal ring in play. Either way, Frank has abandoned his life of crime. To start with, he already has plenty of money. With roughly $49 million in counterfeits unaccounted for and having been sold at 30 cents on the dollar, that would leave Frank with $14.7 million. After paying his $1,350 fine, that would still leave him with $14.7 million. However, he hasn't retired to some tropical reach quite yet. Instead, Frank works as a private consultant for governments and businesses looking to avoid counterfeiters. It's the same path taken by many hackers and other counterfeiters, and it's not only lucrative, but completely legal. In addition, he also created the Paradigm Shift program, a life coaching program that he advertises on his website, though there does not actually seem to be any way to purchase it. But like we said, Frank still has millions of dollars of clean money left over from his time as the world's most successful and prolific counterfeiter. He counterfeited more money than anybody in history, and even after being arrested, all it cost him was 6 weeks in jail and a small fine. He is a living, breathing reminder that all of those people that say crime doesn't pay just haven't been paying attention.